Somewhere on every ocean of this planet, at this very moment, thousands of ships are moving. Container vessels the size of city blocks. Tankers carrying the world's oil. Bulk carriers loaded with grain, coal, iron ore. Ferries threading between islands. Navy warships patrolling silent coasts. Each of them, when you look below the waterline, shares one ancient characteristic, not by accident. Not by artistic choice. The red at the bottom of a ship is one of the oldest and most consequential decisions in the history of human civilization. This is the story of that color. Of the invisible enemy that made it necessary. Of the copper that saved navies. Of the worms that nearly stopped empires. Of the paint that keeps global trade moving. This is red below the waterline. To understand the red, you must first understand what lurks beneath every ocean, every estuary, every harbor on Earth. The sea is not empty. It is alive, teeming with organisms microscopic and massive, ancient and relentless. And for as long as humans have sailed, the sea has been trying to take their ships back. The process is called biofouling. It begins within hours of a ship entering the water. A microscopic film of bacteria forms on the hull, a kind of biological welcome mat. Within days, single-celled algae arrive. Within weeks, larger organisms follow. Barnacles. Tube worms. Mussels. Hydroids. Each one making a permanent home on the hull of the ship. By itself, a barnacle seems harmless. But multiply it by 10,000, by 100,000, and you begin to understand the problem. A heavily fouled ship can carry tons of extra living weight. Its smooth hull becomes a rough, irregular surface dragging against the water with every mile. The effect on speed is dramatic. A ship covered in heavy biofouling can lose as much as 20 to 30% of its fuel efficiency. In an age of sail, that meant the difference between arriving and never arriving at all, but barnacles were only part of the threat. The deeper danger came from something far more insidious. Teredo novalis. The shipworm. Despite its name, the shipworm is not actually a worm. It is a bivalve, a mollusk, related to the clam. But where a clam sits still on the seafloor, Teredo novalis is a burrower. It uses its tiny shell-tipped body to drill into submerged wood, tunneling through planks and beams as it feeds on the cellulose within. A single shipworm is barely the size of a finger. But they never travel alone. Thousands can infest a single wooden hull simultaneously, and because they enter as larvae through a pinhole opening, their devastation is invisible until it is catastrophic. From the outside, an infested ship's hull can look perfectly intact, right up until it collapses. Ancient mariners knew Teredo novalis by many names. Greek sailors called it the ship devourer. Roman writers recorded entire fleets lost to its tunneling. The Arab navigator Ibn Majid, writing in the 15th century, described the horror of a hull that had become, in his words, like a honeycomb, all galleries and no wood. For over 2,000 years of seafaring history, this creature was one of the single greatest threats to human exploration. Not storms. Not pirates. Not navigation errors, worms, and so, from the very beginning, sailors searched for a way to fight back. The earliest known antifouling method was pitch, the thick, dark residue of burning wood or coal. Sailors had been sealing the seams of their hulls with pitch for millennia. It was waterproof, it was available, and it was sticky enough to resist the sea's constant assault. But pitch alone was not enough to stop the worms. The Romans, ever pragmatic, experimented with lead sheathing, thin sheets of lead hammered over the underwater hull. The lead was too dense and toxic for most marine organisms to penetrate, and it offered reasonable protection. But lead is heavy, and heavy ships are slow ships, and slow ships lose wars. The Romans could not make it work at scale. Through the Dark Ages and into the medieval period, the dominant solution was simple and brutal: haul the ship out of the water regularly and scrape its hull by hand. Sailors called this careening. A vessel would be deliberately tipped onto its side on a beach, its hull exposed, and teams of workers would scrape, burn, and retar it before it was launched again. It was effective. It was also exhausting, time-consuming, and impossible during a long ocean voyage. Ships at sea for months had no way to clean their hulls. By the time they arrived, they were often dangerously fouled. By the 15th century, the stakes had risen dramatically. The great European powers, Portugal, Spain, England, the Netherlands, were sending ships to the far corners of the world. The voyages were longer. The oceans were wider. The consequences of a slow or weakened hull were now measured not just in lost cargo, but in lost colonies, lost spices, lost gold, lost empires. Something had to change. In the early 1600s, English shipbuilders began experimenting with a new approach, sheathing hulls with an additional layer of thin wooden planking, a sacrificial outer skin that the worms could attack while leaving the structural hull beneath intact. It helped, but it was expensive, it added weight, and it needed replacing regularly. Then, in the 1670s, reports began emerging from the Caribbean. English ships that had been given a coating of a particular mineral compound were returning from long voyages in noticeably better condition than their peers. Their hulls were cleaner. Their speeds were better maintained. The compound was copper. Copper is one of the oldest metals known to humanity. Its distinctive color, that warm, reddish-brown, has been prized for thousands of years. But copper's greatest quality, the one that would change the history of seafaring, is chemical. Copper is toxic to marine organisms. When copper comes into contact with seawater, it slowly dissolves, releasing copper ions into the immediate environment around the hull. To barnacle larvae, to shipworm eggs, to the algae and bacteria trying to find purchase on the hull, those copper ions are lethal. They cannot attach. They cannot survive. The British Royal Navy grasped the potential immediately. In 1761, HMS Alarm became the first major Royal Navy vessel to have its entire hull sheathed in copper, over 400 sheets of thin copper plate, nailed directly to the wooden planks below the waterline. The results were extraordinary. HMS Alarm returned from a long Caribbean posting with a hull so clean it was almost unprecedented. The barnacles that had defeated every previous solution had found nothing to grip. The worms had found no way through the toxic copper barrier. Within 2 decades, the Royal Navy had coppered the bottoms of virtually its entire fleet. The decision would have geopolitical consequences that still echo today. Coppered ships were faster, by as much as a third, than their uncoppered counterparts. They required less frequent maintenance. They could sustain longer deployments without performance degradation. In the Atlantic trade wars, in the battles of the American Revolution, and most dramatically at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, the superior speed and hull condition of copper-bottomed British ships gave the Royal Navy an edge that no amount of seamanship by its opponents could fully overcome. A naval historian once wrote that copper sheathing was the most consequential naval technology between the invention of the cannon and the age of steam. It is not a widely remembered innovation. But the world we inhabit was shaped, in part, by the toxic properties of a reddish metal hammered to the bottom of wooden ships. Copper sheathing was not without problems. Where copper met the iron bolts used to fasten the hull timbers, a galvanic reaction occurred, the seawater acting as an electrolyte between two dissimilar metals, causing accelerated corrosion of the iron. Ships began losing bolts. Structural failures resulted. The Navy tried copper bolts. They bent too easily. They tried to eliminate the contact between metals. It was impractical. For a generation, the solution was the problem, but the age of wooden ships was already ending. Iron and then steel hulls were coming, and with them, a new era for antifouling, and the direct ancestor of the red paint we see today. By the mid-19th century, the world's merchant fleets and navies were rapidly transitioning from wood to iron, and from sail to steam. The shipworm problem, so existential for wooden hulls, was solved by steel. Teredo navalis cannot bore through metal. But biofouling remained. Barnacles do not care whether they are attaching to wood or iron. Weed cares only that a surface exists and water surrounds it. And the drag problem was, if anything, more commercially urgent than ever. Steamships burned coal, coal cost money, and every percentage of efficiency lost to a fouled hull hit directly on the balance sheet. The answer was paint. Chemists in Britain, the United States, and continental Europe raced to develop paints that could carry the antifouling properties of copper in a form applicable to iron and steel hulls. The key compound they kept returning to was copper oxide, the reddish powder formed when copper is oxidized. Mixed into a paint medium, linseed oil, resin, tar, copper oxide could be applied to a hull in hours rather than the days it took to nail copper sheeting. It was cheaper. It was lighter. And it retained copper's lethal toxicity to marine life. The color it produced was unmistakable red, that particular reddish-brown, technically closer to a brick red or terracotta, became synonymous with the underwater hull of a ship. By the late 1800s, it was so universal that it had become not just a technical choice but a visual convention. A ship without a red bottom looked, to experienced eyes, somehow incomplete. Unprepared. Unsafe. Through the 20th century, the chemistry grew more sophisticated. Tributyl, TBT, compounds became the dominant antifouling agent from the 1960s, proving extraordinarily effective at killing marine organisms on contact. The paints were still, largely, red, partly tradition, partly because the copper compounds that gave the richest red were often part of the formula. But TBT came with a cost that only became apparent decades later. By the 1980s and 1990s, marine biologists were documenting something alarming in harbors and ports around the world. Oyster fisheries were collapsing. Whelks were showing severe hormonal abnormalities. Coral communities in heavily trafficked waters were in unexplained decline. The cause, when identified, was TBT, the extraordinarily effective antifouling compound leaching from millions of holes into the world's oceans. TBT proved to be a potent endocrine disruptor, interfering with the reproductive biology of marine mollusks at concentrations measured in parts per trillion. Almost undetectably small concentrations were causing population-level damage to marine ecosystems. In 2008, following decades of research and lobbying, the International Maritime Organization introduced a global ban on TBT-based antifouling systems. It was one of the most significant environmental restrictions ever imposed on the shipping industry. The industry responded with a new generation of antifouling technologies. Self-polishing copolymers, paints engineered to erode gradually with the water flow across the hull, continuously exposing a fresh layer of biocide at a controlled rate. Silicone-based foul-release coatings that work not by killing organisms but by making the whole surface so smooth and slippery that nothing can maintain a grip as the ship moves. Nanotechnology coatings that replicate the microscopic textures found on shark skin, surfaces that have evolved over millions of years to resist biological attachment. And, for the most part, they are still red, not because they have to be. Modern antifouling paint can be formulated in almost any color. Blue-hulled ships exist. Black antifouling is available. Some newer vessels use gray, but the red persists. Partly, it is tradition, the vast, conservative weight of maritime history pressing toward the familiar. Partly, it is practical, the deep red contrasts sharply with both the gray-blue of ocean water and the black waterline stripe many ships carry, making it easy at a glance to read the ship's load. The more cargo aboard, the lower the ship sits, the less red you can see. In emergencies, that red hull is visible from search and rescue helicopters even in rough seas, but mostly, the red is a memory. A living monument to the copper that saved the Royal Navy, to the shipworms that threatened empires, to the invisible arms race between human civilization and the organisms of the deep. Today, roughly 90% of the world's traded goods move by sea. The global shipping fleet numbers over 100,000 vessels. Every one of them is fighting the same battle against biofouling that a Phoenician merchant sailor fought 3,000 years ago. The economics are staggering. The shipping industry spends an estimated $10 billion annually on antifouling paint and hull maintenance. But the cost of not spending it is far greater. A major container ship with heavy biofouling can consume up to 40% more fuel than a clean-hulled equivalent. At current fuel prices, for a ship making transcontinental voyages, that represents millions of additional dollars in operating costs per year. Multiplied across the global fleet, biofouling costs the shipping industry an estimated $150 billion annually in excess fuel consumption and maintenance. Every ship in the world must periodically undergo drydocking, being lifted entirely out of the water for hull inspection and recoating. For large vessels, this happens every 3 to 5 years. It is one of the largest single expenses in a ship's operational life, often running to millions of dollars for a single docking. The paint that goes back on is, almost always, red, and then there is the environmental dimension that the TBT crisis never fully resolved. Every antifouling coating, no matter how carefully engineered, introduces chemicals into the marine environment. Port cities, where ships congregate, show measurably higher concentrations of antifouling compounds in their sediments. Marine biologists continue to study the long-term effects of our best current solutions, knowing that the problem of biofouling cannot be solved without trading one set of consequences for another, the perfect antifouling coating, one that is non-toxic to non-target species, durable, cost-effective, and maintenance-free, remains one of the great unsolved problems of marine engineering. There is a color at the bottom of every ship. A color that most people who have ever stood on a harbor wall, or watched a vessel pass on the horizon, or flicked through a photograph of a capsized wreck, will have seen, and almost certainly never thought about. It is the color of copper, touched by seawater in time. The color of the compound that saved the British fleet in the age of sail, that kept global trade moving through the age of steam, that continues, in new chemical forms, to push back against the relentless biological pressure of the sea. It is the color of an invisible war fought on every ocean, every hour of every day, a war that began the moment the first human lashed timber to timber and dared to push away from shore. It is tradition and it is chemistry and it is history and it is commerce, all compressed into a single reddish-brown stripe stretched across the belly of the world's most essential machines. The sea never stops trying to reclaim what we build in it, and so we keep painting.